We're visiting a museum today that started out as a comic strip. Believe it or not, let's go. Thank you for talking with us today.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do here?
Sure. I'm Nora Campbell. I'm the regional manager of the Ripley attractions for Maryland, including both Baltimore and the Ocean City locations. So I oversee the general operations as well as staffing, maintenance issues, things like that.
Okay. Now, this is Ripley's Believe It or Not. I grew up in an era where I saw Ripley's in the comics and in the papers,
Sure.
but there might be some people who might just know of Ripley's Believe It or Not as those weird museums all over the place. Who is Ripley, or who was Ripley?
That's an interesting question too. So a lot of people, and it's something we discuss in the company. You know, do we promote him? Do we let the world remember who he was? He was one of the world's greatest explorers. We called him the modern day Marco Polo. He was the very first person inducted into the Cartoon Hall of Fame and has the longest running cartoon series in the world. During the Great Depression, he was one of the few Americans to actually amass his fortune during that time period, and he traveled around the world. He was born in Santa Rosa, California, back in the late 1800s, and then moved to San Francisco to work for a paper there. And actually, he was originally into sports.
Okay.
He wasn't so much, he sort of did sports and cartooning, but he was all self-taught and got a job, went to the East Coast, and Hearst, the famous William Hearst, found out about him and said hire him. And his first job, he was started at $100,000.
Wow.
Which is remarkable. I mean, even in today's value. And so what he would do, in a funny way, he was the world's first a lot. He was the first person to do a radio broadcast underwater. He was the first person to do a radio broadcast that was transmitted to multiple continents at one time.
Wow.
And he traveled around the world, and this was at a time when it wasn't so easy to get to China. It wasn't. I mean, we think a 20-hour flight now is a nightmare. This man traveled to 201 countries when it would take you months on steamer trains to get there. And it all sort of started, how his first cartoon started, how he kind of got into the Believe It or Not. And sometimes when people are confused about the museum or what we do as a museum, I always say, well, believe it or not, when do you use that expression?
When it's something so crazy
that you can't believe it.
You can't believe
but
it.
It's true.
But it's true.
So everything in the museums are true. Everything in the museums are real. So basically the museums are a collection of unusual artifacts and artwork from around the world, and this all started with Robert Ripley's collection.
Wow.
His very first museum, his very first auditorium, and that's what we call them, ODD, auditorium, was in Chicago at the World's Fair in 1933.
Really?
And we have a coffin here in Baltimore, or sarcophagus, excuse me, that he purchased in Egypt that was displayed at his very first auditorium.
At this museum?
At this location.
Wow,
Yeah.
at the World's Fair. That is so cool.
Yeah, so I mean, he goes back and he traveled the world, and the interesting thing was his passing. He had a heart attack while in the middle of discussing taps. Just because why not be a Believe It or Not on your way out? And he went into the hospital and he was ill for a few days and then finally passed. But it was during a discussion about the taps,
The
military
song.
taps.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is one way to send yourself off.
Right. But yeah, he was. A lot of people call him the first blogger.
Really?
And actually, and to let me go back, his very first cartoon, so he, at the time, was doing a lot of sports-related stuff, and he was a sports cartoonist. So before photography was really, mainstream, he would just illustrate something that had happened. And during the slow period, sports period, he came up with, it was called Champs and Chumps, and it was just unusual athletic feats.
Okay.
The guy who ran backwards the fastest, things like that. And he, at the very last minute, crossed it out and wrote Believe It or Not. And that became the very first Believe It or Not cartoon.
Wow. Now, are the Believe It or Not cartoons still running?
They do, yeah. No, they're still in syndication. I believe they're on their 4th artist ever since the 1930s.
And that's something to say for staying power in a world where we have the internet, everybody has a camera on them at all points, that a cartoon will still, a drawn cartoon about something real life is powerful enough to have people still want to read it.
Yeah. Well, and he was actually, his cartoons were really, really influential too for a number of other reasons. He was very inflammatory. Everything he said was always true, but he would say it in maybe a bombastic way to get a response. So my favorite was, if not for Robert Ripley, the United States would have no national anthem. And I get asked about that. They're like, no, you don't mean it. Well, Robert Ripley wrote a cartoon that said, the United States has no national anthem, and it's based on an English drinking song. And people, rabble, 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 everybody were up in arms about that. And he said, don't write to me, write to your congressman. Star Spangled Banner had been unofficially adopted by our country, but not officially. And it was because of his cartoon. There was a letter writing campaign. I believe 5 million letters were written into Congress saying, ratify this song. And because of that cartoon, there was a push, and it was eventually ratified.
Wow. Because you take it for granted, it's Star Spangled Banner, it's our national anthem. It's always been our national anthem, at least in our minds.
Right.
But do you know about when he did that?
I believe it was in the 40s, but I don't have the date.
So our national anthem is less than 100 years old as officially adopted. Officially.
Yeah.
Wow.
But then he would write things too. One of the ones that he was called unpatriotic for was his cartoon that said Charles Lindbergh was not the first man to fly across the Atlantic. And he was true. There had been 2 dirigibles that had flown across that had carried.
Really?
He was the 67th, I believe, is what he said. And it was because 2 dirigibles carrying over 30 people had already crossed. Now, he was the first solo flight. So that's what I mean. He would do little word plays where he was technically correct. But he would make people think, and at a time, especially during the Depression, where it was hard for a lot of people, that this was their way to travel, to see the world, to learn about the Indian mystics, and all those unusual characters that Ripley's is sort of known for. We have the old ones, the lighthouse candle man, the man in China who had a candle. He would the wick was actually out of his head.
Really?
And he would lead people through the streets that way, to the modern day Eric, the lizard man. So we still support all of the local.
There is this interesting thing that I found looking at his comics and looking at his life is that, especially during the Depression era, he was bringing people not only information, but a way of escaping their, the fact that they didn't have a lot of money. They could take some time and see these things. But at the same time, some of the people that were featured in, not just most of the people featured in these comics, they were being held up as heroes in some cases. And we haven't talked about it yet, but Johnny Eck,
a Baltimore native,
might have, given a different life, have not survived or not prospered. Right. But because he found his niche and he found his strength and he went and lived life, he was able to live a good life. And it seems like Robert's comics were holding up people who might sometimes feel ashamed and as an outcast.
Well, it's interesting you say that because one of the things that we focus on a company is anti-bullying campaigns, and we discuss how we are all so much similar and biologically, genetically.
Right.
But those differences are what make us unique, and that's what makes the world and this living here exciting. And he definitely did highlight people. And Johnny Eck is actually my favorite example for school groups, and we have them come through here. I love to use Johnny Eck as an example of you can do anything. He was a magician, a conductor, a composer, a film actor, a juggler, an acrobat. I mean, what he did was just it was amazing what he was able to do in his life.
And he was half a man. And
did you hear about his magic trick with his brother?
Is that the song in half
Yeah,
one?
that was one of my favorite stories. They said women would pass out in the audience when Johnny Eck would come out on his hands.
I think Jeffrey Gordon Pratt told us this story that they used to come across car wrecks on the side of the road back before they would pull them.
I've never heard this.
Yeah, back before they would pull the car wrecks away as quickly as they do now. They would leave him there for a few days whenever somebody could come by. So they had this fascination of him and his brother. When they would find a car wreck, they would stop and photograph themselves on it. And in some cases, cops would come by or passerbys, and Johnny would lay down and be like, "Help, help!"
I have sort of a blue sense of humor, so I find that very funny.
and people would be like, "Oh my God, are you okay?" And then he'd get up and walk.
Walk in
Yep,
his
I'm
arms?
perfectly fine.
Yeah. Oh,
So,
that's very cool. He
it's-
just seemed like a wonderful person.
And it's really that case of embracing your life and
And I'm
not
sure it was
getting
hard.
down. Oh,
I'm sure it was
yeah.
hard for him, but he could have become a hermit, never leaving his home again, but
Yeah.
he chose to embrace.
And push as far as he could.
Mm-hmm.
So, what kind of exhibits do you have here?
Sure. Well, we have a collection of unusual artifacts and artwork from around the world. And we do have a couple of replicas, but it'll say replica. For
Okay.
instance, we have an Iron Maiden. And actually, interesting, one of the first things you see when you come to our museum is a collection of crown jewels.
Okay.
Obviously, we don't have the real crown jewels, so if you read the show card to understand why do we have these replicas, it was Robert Ripley's collection. And the last actual photo of him taken before he died was with that collection.
Wow.
So it's significant to the Ripley story. We've got some of my favorite pieces. We have one called Ocean's 11th Hour, which is a piece of driftwood that's been carved to look like Father Time's head
Wow.
coming out of the piece. And then surrounding it are endangered animals that can be found off the Florida coast.
Wow.
Really stunning, 6-7 foot tall, gorgeous. We have Hogwarts Castle made out of over 500,000 matchsticks, and it is so detailed, it would blow your mind what they put into it. And then some of the artifacts that I like, obviously it's a lot. Ripley was bringing back kind of the weird and unusual
Right.
things. We have genuine shrunken heads, which I think a lot of people assume are fake. They're really real.
They're real.
In fact, I can tell you how to shrink a head. I remind my husband on occasion that I have that skill set. But no, so if you're looking for stuff from Africa, China, South America, from all over the world, and baby carriers, we have a brick from the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Actually,
Wow.
probably to me, the most significant artifact that we have here is we have John Wilkes Booth's gun. Now,
Yeah.
let me clarify. There were two guns found after Lincoln's assassination. One
Okay.
was found in a farmhouse in Virginia. One was found in Ford's Theater.
Okay.
And for 100 years, they didn't know which gun shot Lincoln until the 1970s when they were able to do a ballistics test. And it was determined that the gun that was found at the farmhouse was the one that actually shot Lincoln.
Really?
We have the gun from Ford's Theater. And it's a tiny little gun. It has J. Wilkes Booth engraved on the side. So it's amazing to me. Ripley's also has significant historical items as well.
So, like, growing up, I grew up, there was a Ripley's museum not too far from me. And
Where was that?
there's one up in Buffalo.
Okay.
Well, actually, Niagara Falls.
Yeah, Niagara Falls.
Niagara Falls. And I always thought of it as that place where you went to go see two-headed calves,
Yeah, which we also have.
which you also have. and my first visit here, I was blown away by the amount of art and historical artifacts that you
Yeah.
have.
Some of it is mind-blowing, like there's somebody who does optical illusion knitting, and the piece we have is Hagrid's face. So it's a knitted piece, but when you're looking at it straight on, it's just stripes, but when you look at it from angles, it's Hagrid's face from either angle. And then we have silly things like Nicki Minaj made out of lipstick tubes, but it really is her. When you look at it through your camera lens,
Right.
it really pops to life, or Bill Gates made out of keyboard keys. So we have kind of irreverent, but also a lot of really just mind-blowing, how did somebody come up with this?
Yeah.
The Clintons made out of hamburger grease.
Oh, that's kind of fitting.
Well,
That's-
and you know what it is? I jokingly call it our health section because we have a coffin made out of cigarette butts and cigar butts, and then next to
that's
it is the
amazing.
7-foot tall Clinton portraits. And what it was there was a or the artist wanted to show how much grease was actually in a hamburger, so it was a double patty, and he was able to do a 7-foot sculpture or painting
one.
with it. Yeah, with the oil from the hamburger.
What?
So I like to think of that as our health section.
Yeah, that's really funny. What would you want somebody to take away from this place when they come to visit?
Well, I think for me, I want their eyes to be open to the world and the cultures around the world, because that's really the niche that we fit into.
Okay.
We're displaying cultures from around the world, and we're displaying cultures that aren't as well known. Shrunken heads. Do you know the Indian tribe that shrink heads?
No.
The Guerrero Indian tribe in Ecuador. And that's the kind of stuff you would learn here, is actually, where do these things come from? What is the stories? Every one of our artifacts has a show card that goes with it that'll give you details, like trench art that we have from World War I, things like that. So a lot of interesting history.
It's I go to a lot of museums. I mean, obviously, I'm into history.
Yeah.
And I sometimes feel a little burned out because I always see the same pieces or similar
Sure.
pieces. It's okay, here we're going to get the Egyptian room, we're going to get the North American room, and we're going to get this kind of broad strokes of what they're presented as,
Right.
what our history is presented as. But I find the more I go to the smaller, more niche museums, I actually learn more about them.
Yeah, the more interesting
The
stuff.
more interesting stuff, the more, I guess the best way to say it is the stuff that gave cultures personality.
Right. Right, maybe not the dominant culture.
Right.
But definitely the ones that gave them the personality. I like that description.
And I think that the way that it's presented is a very fun manner.
Yeah, no, I always joke, we're like the more cowbell museum. Things are bright and loud, and we have over 100 interactives, so anytime you see a little handprint or a little green triangle, it means there's something interactive. And of course we're Ripley's, so we have a couple of gags in there too. Like
Right.
open the wrong trust, you might get growled at. Things like that. Drop bridge, maybe you walk out on a bridge, or maybe it kind of drops a little underneath you to give you a startle. So we really try to have a little something for everybody. It's interactive and bright and entertaining for kids, but also, for the adults, or maybe the people, the seniors who even maybe remember, Robert Ripley, kind of more nostalgic to come back and look at some of the things. We actually have some things he collected here.
Wow.
Not everything. Ripley's does a really great job at doing, they go to art shows every year and they hold contests, and they're always looking to collect what they have in Orlando. That's our headquarters.
Okay.
There's a warehouse with tens of thousands of artifacts that haven't found a home. There's shelves of anything from a piece of, what was it? It was a piece of toilet tissue that was found by Marilyn Monroe, or that Marilyn Monroe had, that the hotelier had kept, to rows of mummy hands and rows of shrunken heads and rows
Wow.
of, just all kinds of unique and unusual things.
That is bonkers. And so I'm assuming that even though Robert Ripley has passed, and you were saying that they're continuing on with the comics, and it's not reprinting of old comics, they're
No.
continuing new comics.
The current artist is John Graziano.
So they are really taking what he did, well, not they, you, Ripley's, is taking what Robert Ripley did and going into the future with it.
Definitely. We just started a blog, so we have a couple now. One is called The Bion of the Week, and that's where we have 5 unusual news stories from that week, and you get to pick which one you think is the most unusual. And doing things where we just had a little YouTube video. We're creating a YouTube channel, one where it's about elongated skulls and the process of these cultures, how they would bind children's heads when the skulls were still stuffed. So sometimes these skulls are found and thought to be alien, but it was actually a process among certain tribes.
Wow.
Just like the Padwang woman, the neck, it was considered a status symbol and considered quite beautiful. I think the goal was 25 rings on the neck.
Wow.
So it would continually stretch, but there's always sort of a dark side too, right?
Yeah.
The punishment for infidelity for this tribe, for these women, was the removal of the rings. But at this point, they had subsisted so long with these rings supporting their neck that the muscles in their neck had atrophied, and very often, if the rings were removed, they would suffocate.
What? Wow. Well, you mentioned the YouTube page. If somebody wanted to see the blog, where would they go to find that?
Ripley's, if you go to Ripleys.com, all of the information will get you
information
there.
is there?
Yeah,
Okay.
and it'll also get you to each of our attractions. We have over 30 museums around the world.
Okay.
A lot of people don't know that. We are as far as South Korea, London.
Wow.
We're really all over the place. Copenhagen. Not to mention the United States, of course. We're all over the country.
Now, you were talking about how this is kind of the museum that has more cowbell.
Yeah.
I always find that if something entertains me, I will retain that information more. So when, especially when I was younger, if I went to a museum and it was just all very solemn, you had to be quiet and not talk. And,
It feels boring
it
before
feels
you walk through the door.
boring. Yeah. And you just kind of, your brain shuts off and you're like, okay.
And you're probably looking at amazing things.
Yeah. It's just presented in such a solemn, I guess, I don't even know the way to say it, just boring way.
Yeah. Well, I find that, one of the challenges presenting it the way we do as well, though, is that sometimes I think people don't take it as seriously
Really?
or as reverently as it should be, some of the things that we have, because it's so bright. Like, I'll see reviews where people are like, oh, it's just a bunch of fakes. And I'm like, not at all. But I think maybe because of the way it's displayed, and they don't feel it was given its due.
Okay.
Do look so, it's a double-edged sword with that. But I personally definitely want to be engaged and have more of an immersive experience.
Okay. Now, if somebody wanted to learn more about Robert Ripley and his life, where should they go?
Was just recently, this past year, a book written called A Curious Man, which
Okay.
is, as of right now, the definitive biography on Robert Ripley, and just so interesting about his life. There's also a PBS documentary that came out very recently. It's about
Okay.
an hour long. I believe it was American Life.
Okay.
Also very fascinating, because then you can kind of see some of the old footage and old reels as well.
Oh, nifty.
Yeah, and he had a one-eyed dog named, this is just a funny fact that I love about him, he had a one-eyed dog named Cyclops.
He
A
did.
sheepdog. Yeah, we have a picture of him in the
Oh.
museum when you go through it.
Oh, that's cute.
Perfect.
Perfect
right?
for him.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And one of the things, like a little behind the scenes thing, is we refer to the museums as bions,
Okay.
believe it or not, right? And so when Ripley, he bought a home just outside of Long Island, and he had this old Chinese junk that would sail. It was his prized possession, actually, and he called it Bion Island.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's nifty. What should we make sure we see at this museum before we leave?
Oh, everything.
Everything?
I have so many favorites. It's hard to say. I named a few. The John Wilkes Booth gun, I think, is a can't miss.
Okay.
The shrunken heads are classic Ripleys. And by the way, sometimes you'll hear about Ripleys. Oh, they're all the same. They're all individual, unique artifacts.
Really?
So Ripley's does have the world's largest collection of shrunken heads. And by the way, I don't know what that loophole is, because I know it's illegal to buy and sell human flesh, and I don't know if Ripley's is grandfathered in, but we do have the largest collection of shrunken heads.
Yeah, that's
So
kind of
you-
weird to think about.
You definitely want to see that. And I
Okay.
think just the artwork, I think people are usually pretty amazed when they see what we fit into a small space.
Awesome. Does Ripley's offer any classes or any way for schools to come here?
We do. We offer really great discounted rates for schools and camps and scouting groups. And we have created a couple of programs in-house. My favorite one is, we call it recycling versus upcycling. So a
Okay.
lot of the art you'll see is kind of upcycled. They're using stuff, instead of recycling it, or they remake it into something new.
That's cool.
And one of the examples we use, and it's kind of an easy project for kids, is we'll do an art class where they can make their very own candy art, because that's something else you'll find here. We've got Justin Bieber made out of candy in the museum, which you'll find. But we allow kids to kind of come in and create their own candy art.
Okay.
And then we, do the little Mod Podge over it, so it preserves it for a little bit, and they can take that home. And other things, like we have the Toothpick City, an entire room where it's buildings made out of toothpicks.
Wow.
And so we can do little toothpick sculptures with them, little arts and crafts projects,
That's
kind of
cool.
based around some of the things we have. And then the big thing we do too is we have an anti-bullying campaign.
Okay.
So we have an entire program where we talk about being inclusive instead of exclusive.
That is really, really
We
cool.
have fun games for corporate groups too, to come in if they want to do something a little bit more irreverent than traditional
You know,
activity.
you can only do those trust games so many times
Right.
before.
I'll catch you. Yeah.
before-
Well, one of them we do that's kind of interesting is they're divided into groups, each individual. So that the premise is that you're stranded on a deserted island. The ghost of Robert Ripley comes to you and says, you can choose any 5 things from my museum to survive, for survival or entertainment or comfort. And as a group, they each pick their 5 individual that they want, and then they go back to a group and they negotiate
Okay.
what they're going to present, and then they've got to present it to the group. So it's all about the art of negotiation and strategy. And,
Interesting.
And who comes up with the best.
That's a fun way
Just kind of
to
fun, silly
tackle something so.
scavenger
Yeah.
hunts. We have photo scavenger hunts where you have to take funny photos throughout the museum, which school groups can also do. And with everybody having their own phone, it's so easy.
It's really becoming a more immersive world.
Yeah, and then you go back to the office and you make fun of your coworkers.
You were scared of the Iron Maiden. We're going to hold that over
Right?
your head for the rest of your career.
The Iron Maiden is right next door to the 12-foot Pop-Tart Dino, so watch that.
Thank you for talking with us today.
very welcome.
And I encourage everybody to come out and see this place. Really, it's not just shrunken heads, which are really cool to see, But there is so much to see here, and so much history, and so much art and culture that it's if you're ever in a town that has a Ripley's, take some time out and go see it.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.